So thanks for coming, and let me introduce our presenter briefly. Taliesin Joan Granville Lee focuses on ecological and ecofeminist ethics. Formerly a molecular biologist, she received her PhD from Boston University School of Theology, which she completed while living in Basel, Switzerland. She recently founded an organization, Climate Resilience Chaplaincy, an organization offering diverse resources for wrapping our minds around the enormity of what she calls big R resilience, as well as how to approach it and build it in a spiritual, policy-based, and preparedness aspect. She is also an adjunct professor with Wesley Theological Seminary and a regular contributor to the Feminism and Religion blog, where she explores intersections of eco-justice, grief, permaculture, and nature connection. Please welcome Taliesin for our presentation today.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here, and thank you very much, Ilse, for inviting me. Oh, and Norm, I'm so glad you made it. Who's the co-chair with Ilse of this monetary policy group, which I've been coming to for a really long time. It's got to be at least 10 years that I've been coming. And last year, Ilse and I had a conversation afterwards, and he asked me if I would talk about my experiences living in Switzerland and the way that their monetary policy affects society. And so thank you for that. And I'm going to start to share my screen. Thumbs up. Okay, good. Okay. So, and you can hear me, right? Okay. So I titled my talk, Like a Well-Made Watch, the large thriving middle class of the carefully engineered free market Swiss economy. Now, probably people know that Switzerland is famous for watchmaking already, and watches are this, obviously collection of a lot of different interlocking parts that all need to be working together in order for the watch to work. And that was really my experience of living in Swiss society, that it has all these factors that need to work synergistically in order for everything to function. So I thought it was really a perfect symbol of what, my experience had been. Just to give you a sense of where I'm going in this talk, I'm going to start by talking a bit about that interrelated synergy idea. Then I'm going to step back and give a kind of ethical, philosophical, and historical background of how it got to where it is today. Talk about how it's doing now, having it, in achieving and maintaining resilience, particularly with the pandemic. And then I'm going to open up the concept of implications for other places, which I'll give some of my thoughts, and hopefully we can explore more together in the Q&A period. Okay. So for my first slide, I'm going to show you this image. Hopefully it'll make you laugh. It's like kind of odd thing to start a talk with this image. I'm guessing everybody knows this is a toilet brush. And I know it's kind of random to start a talk with a toilet brush, but hopefully that woke us all up and made us laugh, and might as well keep things interesting. The reason I picked this picture is that I had this kind of funny epiphanal experience after I'd been living there a few years. I went into a bathroom, and you go in, it was at a restaurant, okay, so it was a public bathroom, and they each have, it's like not like here where these ugly metal stalls, right? Like you get your own little room, like a closet, right? You go in, you close the door, it's very nice, it's very private. And I turned around, and sitting there on the floor was this toilet brush. And I just kind of froze, and I just stood there staring at this toilet brush, and my brain just, like, all these clicks were happening inside my brain. And it occurred to me that I don't think I'd ever gone into a public bathroom in the US in my entire life and seen a toilet brush, unless it was in the hand of a janitor. And I just realized all of a sudden, like, wow, that is the difference between Switzerland and the United States. So why is that, right? Like, I almost took a picture of it, but then I was like, okay, I can't take a picture of a toilet brush. That's too weird even for me. Why is it? What needs to be true? Because the first thought I had, right, was, and I wish we were in person because you could be like shouting things out to me, but we can't really do that. But the first thought I had was like, somebody might steal it, right? But no, of course, no one's going to steal it. So the first thing you have to understand is people don't steal, because why would they steal? I mean, they have enough toilet brushes and everything else, and so they don't, why would they steal it? Nobody's going to steal this brush. That's the first thing. Okay, so fine, but why, right? Well, there's this kind of sort of foundation of enough. Everybody has enough. They have enough money, and they have enough of a salary, and they have enough of the things that they need, so that they don't feel a sense of scarcity, like, well, even though I don't really need that, I better take it anyway, like, I don't know, for a rainy day or something. This is the odd thing about Switzerland. People really don't steal. Somebody once left a bag with, so the franc is about the same as the dollar, right? There's like, I don't know, 200,000 in cash. And it was just like, the tram driver just returned it, right? Or I remember when I would work in the cafes, like I was trying to write my dissertation, I'd go to these cafes and people would just leave their laptops on the table and they'd go to the bathroom or go get a drink of, go get a tea. They don't steal. Okay. Not like never, but pretty much never, because why would they? They don't need to, because not only do they have enough, but they know they have enough. So they don't feel this sense of like, oh, I better grab what I can. Okay. Also, there's this other thing that happens in Switzerland where people actually clean up after themselves. And this is kind of funny because, you know, you you people don't litter because everybody wants to have a clean street or a clean path to walk down. So if somebody drops something, you assume it was a mistake and you just, like pick it up, or you tell them, "Oh, hey, you dropped something." They don't litter. And they have this kind of idea that it's our responsibility because, we all want the same thing. So they clean up after themselves. They also aren't worried about getting sick or getting hurt. And if they do get sick or hurt, they have health care so they don't sue. And so, if you've got this toilet brush, you're like, oh, it's messy. And what if somebody gets germs and they get sick and they're going to sue the restaurant? The restaurant, that doesn't happen. It's just not the way things are. So they clean up, they don't get sick, they don't sue. I mean, of course they do get sick. But the other part is that they're not in a rush. Switzerland runs on time. It's famous for this. Remember the watches, right? Like the trams and the trains, they're always on time, like to the minute. But they're not rushed. If there's a line, people just wait patiently because they're not in a rush, because they're not overworked. They're not working 80, 100 hours a week. They work a normal work week and then they go home and they have vacation time, and it's like not a big deal. And so they kind of methodically go through doing things in a kind of efficient way. They're very efficient, but yeah, they feel like, oh yeah, I have time. I have a minute to clean this, so that the next person has a more pleasant experience. It's my responsibility. And that kind of leads to a general overall picture of what I call independent communalism. There's a real independence, like I'm going to do me and you do you, and we leave each other alone. But there's also this sense of communal responsibility that I'm going to clean up my messes so that they don't affect other people. So I thought about using something boring like a refrigerator, but I couldn't even find a picture of a Swiss refrigerator that was as small as the one that we had in our flat. This one's bigger. It looks a lot like the one we had, except it's actually bigger than the one that we had, probably because I was looking in a US website. And so that was another symbol that shows the interconnectedness of all these pieces that have to work in order for the whole picture to function. Was we moved into this flat and this refrigerator and freezer were so small. I was like, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage with this tiny refrigerator? I mean, I felt like I was in college. Well, it works because of all these other pieces. First of all, wherever you live, there is a small grocer that is near you. Now, that's useful for a number of reasons, but partly because you can get in and out quickly. They have everything you need, but it's not this huge superstore that takes you 20 minutes just to walk through. So wherever you live, there's a small grocer nearby. But as you all probably know, everywhere you go, you're either walking or biking or using public transportation. And the public transportation is key because what happens is this small economy develops around the stops, the tram stops or the bus stops. And so you go wherever you're going, you come home, you get out, and there's the grocer, and there's the baker, and there's the shoemaker who actually fixed several pairs of shoes for us, which made our lives much easier. So the public transport piece means that, no matter who you are, remember, you're not overworked, so you're not in a rush. And on your way home, you just stop and you get a few groceries so that you can go home and cook them. That's just very easy and pleasant. I have to tell you, I actually hate grocery shopping. But while I lived there, I stopped hating it for those years that I lived there. Small refrigerators are very energy efficient. I mean, compared to big ones, because they're the biggest energy hog in our home, basically. They're the biggest use of energy. And so the Swiss like to be energy efficient. They like to be ecological. And so it's better to have it small. They also believe in fresh cooked meals. They don't even have microwaves. They believe in slow food and cooking things the old fashioned way and eating nutritious food. And they have time to do it because, again, they're not like working long hours, and they have this concept of leisure time, which again is leading to the sense of abundance. And remember what I said about the local economy, right? So in addition to all of that, there's this kind of culture where there's a lot more independence for kids. That was actually the biggest thing that my kids missed when we moved back was, while I was writing my dissertation, 2 nights a week they would cook supper. And so of course we didn't always have everything we needed, so they would just go down to the store, sometimes on their scooters or sometimes they would walk and they would just get what they needed. They'd come back, they'd cook supper. They were in late elementary and middle school at the time. So they weren't very old. And because, there's no poverty, there's no crime, and so it was very safe and they could just go to the store and get what they needed and cook me supper, which was incredibly helpful. But also, really, it just gave them such a sense of independence, and the safety and the independence go hand in hand. And it's all related to that same refrigerator. So the Swiss have this kind of sense of quality over quantity and just having something good rather than having more and more and more again, which comes all out of that sense of abundance. When you have enough, 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 when you have enough of enough, you end up with a feeling of abundance. So those are like two symbols of the kind of interlocking pieces of the watch that I kind of wanted to offer as examples that show how all of those things need to be there in order for this whole system to work, to function the way it's intended. But how did it happen? And the flip side of that is, why didn't it happen in other places? And I've thought a lot about this and I've read about it. And I think some of it is a bit of luck or accident. For example, Switzerland has a unique geography. It doesn't have any coastlines and it's got a lot of mountains. And so they can really more easily regulate their borders. It's not always true everywhere in Switzerland, but generally speaking, it's easy for us to criticize our own border policies, but the Swiss can kind of have their system and have it be functioning. And then they can say, okay, how many um, immigrants can we absorb, or how many asylum seekers can we absorb so that we can actually make it continue to work? And they figure that out, and that's how many they accept. And that, it's again very, regimented. And a lot of places can't do that, right? It's also small. So, other places are much bigger and less, more unwieldy. It's small in area. It's only 16,000 square miles, but it's also small in numbers. It's only 8.5 million people. Um, Obviously, that's not very big. The biggest city is, a couple 100,000 people. But they have had a lot of emigration and immigration. There's always, for for a millennium, there's been flow. But those two things also, they matter, but they also affect the culture too. Now the culture is diverse. It's got these different cultural linguistic regions: the German, the French, the Italian, and the Romansh. um, but I think partly because, they've got this inherent diversity, which is good, but because they have more control over their borders, they can also kind of have change happen a little more slowly. So there is xenophobia, but it means that there's also this kind of sense of what it means to be from this part of Switzerland that can be consistently handed down. And I do think that that gives a kind of stability, a reassuring kind of stability in the face of other disruptions. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and a little bit about pandemics in a minute. But because of some of these other factors, sometimes it's easier for me to think about how what they do might work on a state level rather than a federal level for us. But anyway, we'll keep thinking about that later. For now, backing up, we talk a little bit about history and ethical foundations. I mean, we are at an ethics conference, right? So it's kind of interesting. Historically, Switzerland began as just these isolated valleys, communities and mountain valleys, and they were different from each other. They had their own dialects. They were very proud, very independent, and eventually they joined together and created this kind of confederation. But they never lost that sense of kind of diverse pride, but also sense of connection with the wilderness. So there's a kind of ethic and aesthetic of outdoors, being outside, being kind of healthy, and hiking and biking, and also just when they do urban design, making it feel like you're in the wilderness, which is really beautiful and adds a lot to the quality of life too. I mentioned that there's this built-in diversity, and I think that that also helped contribute to the more open and humanistic ethic of the country, the philosophy and the religion, in contrast to the intransient theologies during the Reformation. John Calvin had a much easier time in Basel than he had in France, and Zwingli and Erasmus's thought, who, as they say, laid the egg that Luther hatched. Really a very open, kind of flexible and less rigid approach to diversity of thought, which was also helped by the printing presses, which everybody's familiar with from the Reformation. It was a really big part of Switzerland and Basel, where I lived. And it led to a kind of what I think of as a kind of pragmatic dialectic between traditionalism and progress. And pragmatism is kind of moving through this, kind of goal, but it's always this dialectic back and forth with traditionalism and progress. And so, for example, when, during the Reformation in Basel, they never wanted to prosecute heretics, supposed heretics. So long as you just sort of renounced the heresy, then they were fine and live and let live and whatnot during both the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. There was this kind of movement of power that came from the nobility and the bishops, and then it moved down and it kind of went to the merchants and the merchant lords, and then it kind of went to the craftspeople, and then eventually down to the working class. And the only way that was possible, that kind of over time transfer of power, was actually the openness of those in power to change. There was an openness to accept that kind of progress. So I think that's just an important factor. Okay, so then the Swiss, formed this loose confederation of the different regions or cantons in 1848. And part of what happened at that time in the mid-19th century was that the railways were being built. And there was a concern that they were going to go around Switzerland and not through it and basically leave Switzerland behind. And so one of these merchant leaders from an old rich dynastic family in Zurich, Alfred Escher, helped to create privatized rail, including the famous Gotthard Tunnel through the Alps. Now, at the same time, they kind of realized, well, actually, we don't even have the technology to do what we're trying to do. And now because of that, we have to import it. And that was causing sort of outside influences to affect Switzerland. So they decided, well, why don't we just start it here? So they started a bunch of educational institutions and universities, and including this famous one in Zurich for technology and manufacturing, and also the natural sciences, which led later, as probably some of you know, because of things like Novartis and Syngenta, to the life sciences and biotech boom in Switzerland, as well as their medical advancements. And also, again, because of foreign influence, they started establishing Swiss banks. So that was all because of this development at this time in the mid-19th century. Well, then the other part that I wanted to mention historically is these epidemics and pandemics, which is particularly relevant for us today. In 1867, after the formation of the Confederation, then there was a cholera epidemic in Zurich. And of course, it spread the fastest in the poorer and less sanitary areas. Now, this was in the early days before health authorities really were very well formulated, but there was a health authority, a kind of new health authority, and they did their best to quarantine the illness and to separate people. But at the end of the day, still, it did spread. There were calls for community and solidarity, but what happened really was the people who were able to leave, which was the wealthy people, did flee, and there were 481 people died. The disease did remain confined to Zurich, however. And there's a quote from that time, which is eerily familiar to our own experiences, which I'll read. If you haven't been to Zurich in the past few weeks, you can't really imagine what it's like, both in the streets and in your mind. The impact of the fearful epidemic and the pressure of a sudden loneliness lie heavy on the population, and those who have lived in this situation for weeks cannot avoid taking on such a dim impression. So that was in September of that year, and then the epidemic was confined, and then, basically the citizens decided that almost 500 people dying was nowhere near good enough. Having wealthy people flee was not good enough. So it was followed by demonstrations in December of that year, where thousands and thousands of people demanded more democracy. That was what they felt was the answer, was, we don't have enough democracy. What we need is more democracy. So here's a picture of Alfred Escher, who really did quite a lot, but he was a leader of this liberal top-down kind of regime approach. And the liberal regime was overthrown in favor of more democracy. A new constitution was formed and approved, which lasted a really long time. And then what happened was that this kind of seizing or claiming of a deeper and richer kind of democracy spread to the other areas of Switzerland, the other cantons. So this is kind of what's called the pandemic effect, because the pandemic kind of ripped the scales off the eyes of a lot of people who had assumed that everyone was sort of sharing the wealth and the wellness. And really what happened was the true state of society was revealed, of a lot of people experiencing insecurity and inequality. And there were other factors that helped spur this bit of kind of revolution, including there was already an economic downturn, there was already dissatisfaction with some of the political elitism. But not long after, or around the same time, I should say, there was another epidemic of typhoid in Basel, which led to 4,000 deaths. And Basel had been the last city in Switzerland that still had its medieval city wall up, because the merchants, remember, they were the ones in power at the time. They really liked being able to regulate who was coming and going into the city because of the trade. But because of this typhoid epidemic, then the city wall was removed, and there was this sense that, you know, that it was the air. So they wanted more fresh air and air flow. And they actually, it's really beautiful. It's still there. Where the wall used to be, it's this kind of beautiful grass and flower and tree lined path, because they believed that having more greenery would help cleanse the air. And they did all of these other kinds of developments during that time. For example, there was tuberculosis, particularly the children in the poorer part of Basel. And so they made sure the schools had these really big windows, which let in a lot of light and fresh air. And so that kind of awareness, because of the pandemics and the epidemics, kind of helped spur a lot of the changes that led to a kind of more of a sense of the solidarity with the working class. And it paved the way for stronger unions. And interestingly and importantly, there was social and religious support for socialism, even among, you know, the leaders, the people who had been in power. They weren't against it. They were open to that change, which I think is remarkable. And even in the more conservative areas, especially during and after the World Wars, there was a sense that especially after World War I and World War II, that solidarity among the working class was actually what would bring lasting peace. Another quote from that Zurich cholera epidemic is also eerily relevant for our time. Cholera has led to deeper insights into the people's lives. It was discovered that many of our fellow citizens are positioned in such a way that, with the best will in the world, it is impossible for them to eat properly. Is the worker really there to make every effort only to partially acquire life's needs and be dependent on charity for the rest? Do you have no idea that such conditions must have a depressing and unnerving effect on the sense of honor and morality of the worker? Because half of working families at the time were undernourished. They couldn't feed themselves. And so by 1889, this was in 1867, by 1889, the Constitution had been influenced by socialism and the sort of assumption that the state should be supporting struggling families and communities. And there was a rise of the socialist influence in politics, Social Democratic Party. And at the same time, there was a rise of a kind of pan-Swiss identity, not just for your particular city or region. So those things, socialism and that kind of, I don't know, nationalism, I guess, all helped. So what is this democracy that they created? What does it look like? People talk about direct democracy in Switzerland. And I'm not, like I mentioned before, I'm not really a political ethicist. So other people might be able to speak about this even more later. But basically, it reminds me a little more of what it's like on a state level here. But anyway, direct democracy in Switzerland is basically, there are three instruments of direct democracy, and they're all referendum based. The first one is called a mandatory referendum, and that's anytime you want to change the constitution. Anytime anybody wants to change the constitution, the people have to vote on it, the population, and you need what's called a double majority. The majority of the people and the majority of the cantons or the provinces all have to approve it. Then there are popular referendums. In other words, anybody can bring a referendum to the country, as long as you have enough signatures supporting it. And only 22 out of the 200 that have ever been proposed have passed, but it does give people a sense that they can directly affect the policy of their own country. And then there's what's called the optional ones. For example, if you don't like an existing law or if you don't like an international treaty, you just need a simple majority in order to change that from that referendum. So they do have the federal council. It's like 7 people that get elected who are basically the executive branch. They're like the president, but there's not one president. There's just 7 of them on this council, and they take turns being the acting president, but it doesn't mean that they have more power than the other 6. It's just the way that works. And so a lot of times people don't know who the Swiss, like people in Switzerland don't actually know who their president is at any given moment. And they do have a parliament who passes new legislation and amendments to existing legislation, but you can see that even with those things, the individuals have this direct access to their policy. Okay, so what does this all mean, right? And like I said before, I feel like it gives people over time, it's built a sense of abundance. It's moved people from a place of scarcity to a place of abundance slowly and steadily. In the early 1900s, they made it basically, they created a structure so that there would be a multiple party system, not a 2-party system, but a multiple party system. And the result of that, at first it was very contentious, but over time led to just a real sense of compromise and collaboration and alliances and support of unions in order to be able to get anything done. People had to learn to work together. So that's a really important piece. And then we had, as I mentioned, all of the influence of socialism, especially after the 2 world wars. But after the 2 world wars were over, Switzerland's industry was not as badly damaged as other areas, but they also experienced what they call the economic miracle, which was actually a capitalism thing, where they basically had this huge boom of various kinds of industries, including automobile and chemistry and other things like that, and manufacturing. And it's not that those things were without problems, but they brought a great deal of prosperity to Switzerland. So it ended up being a kind of, the Swiss have this real appreciation of socialism and a real appreciation of capitalism at the same time. And so, of course, people thought, the chemical industry was going to be the best thing and save the world, but then it brought all kinds of problems. And so because they had this direct democracy that they're all kind of have access to and engaged with, then when those problems would arise, the Swiss would solve them. For example, this big boom in cars caused a decrease in public transportation, but then it caused this huge increase in pollution and nobody liked it. So they changed it and they reprioritized public transit and other things like that. They were dumping all kinds of stuff in the river and nobody liked that either. And so they just stopped, and they changed it. And now the Rhine is beautiful and clean and everybody swims in it like every day, like all year. So basically, there was this shift from the focus earlier on trying to create a more fair society, more public welfare, to a shift toward more widespread prosperity. So we have a society now where about 60% is in the middle class, and that's been stable for quite a while. And then more recently, a shift to creating a more positive quality of life, especially urban quality of life, and making sure that tourism is a thriving industry. So there have been different motivations for the democratic evolution of their monetary policy and their political policy, but it's had that effect over time. So here's an example. Right before we moved there, they had a referendum, a public, one of the popular ones, about whether or not to change the amount of vacation time from 4 weeks paid vacation to 6 weeks paid vacation. And everybody gets paid vacation in Switzerland, but the public voted it down. They voted against it because they thought it wouldn't be good for their economy and because they thought 4 weeks was enough. And 6 weeks is actually not uncommon in that part of the world, but in Switzerland, they thought, no, we don't need it. 4 weeks is enough. And so it's really interesting to me that they could have that sense of abundance and like, let's think about what actually makes sense and works for all of us and actually do that rather than the sense of, oh yeah, we need more, we need more, we need more. So just so you know, the middle class in Switzerland is between about $100,000 and $200,000 a year. And a fifth of the population is above that and a fifth is below it. And in the US, about a little, maybe around half is in the middle class, although that is seen to be eroding. Okay, So we're getting toward the end here. I just wanted to show you a little bit of a comparison so you can see the income distribution in Switzerland is on the left there. I mean, it's better than the other countries, but it's not that much better, but it is a little bit better. They have decent income distribution. The distribution of wealth overall isn't that much better than the US. It's better. But this US News and World Report thing on the right here kind of shows this, it's rated as the best overall country to live in. And the reason for that is that even though they don't have the best socialist system, right? The best distribution of wealth and whatnot. They have really good wages, good unions, a good standard of living, and a good quality of life. And as a result, even people that are in the lowest part are actually considered well off by global standards and generally speaking feel okay or happy or satisfied. And I think that's just, it's not perfect. I just find it interesting. I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. All right, so how did they do with COVID-19? Like most places, they had a very low first wave. Most places around them, I guess it's different everywhere. Italy had a terrible first wave, but like most places, north of there, they had a low first wave, but they're in the middle of a really big second wave. Now, remember, they had this independent communalism thing where they kind of just hoped they could tell people, hey, can you all just stay home? That's what's best. And take responsibility for yourselves. But in the end, it became clear that that's not enough. The hospitals are getting overloaded. And so they've had to enter a second lockdown now. So it has been a mixed bag for them in terms of the COVID response, although the number of deaths has been fairly low in Switzerland, probably partly because of the healthcare. Now, their healthcare in Switzerland is not socialized. It's actually private. It's just that it's universal, it's mandatory, and it's subsidized. So it's not, it's something that they constantly are improving. They're still improving it. And I find this interesting. It's very, very good. And in terms of economic recovery, one of the ways people define resilience is the ability to recover from adversity. They're projecting about a year, which I actually think is pretty impressive myself. So the last part, implications for elsewhere. So I'm not really sure how well these things can translate, but one of the things I like to work on in my work on resilience is what are our barriers and how can we process through these barriers and try to work toward resilience. And so I'm just going to offer two resources that I find particularly helpful. Both of them are from Frances Moore Lappé, who you probably remember at least from Diet for a Small Planet that she wrote years ago. But she's continued to do a lot of great work, and she's written two more recent books, one called Democracy's Edge, in which she has a quote that I feel like, sounds very Swiss, right? She says, hunger isn't caused by a scarcity of food. It's caused by a scarcity of democracy. She calls it thin democracy. And I just reminded me of what happened in Zurich. They said, we need more better democracy. And she's kind of arguing the same thing. Kind of the crux of her arguments is that when you have isolation and separation, and that includes a kind of us versus them separation of identity, it leads to a sense of scarcity. But when you have connection, it leads to a sense of abundance. So that's a kind of crux of her argument and the work that she does. And she talks about similar things in this other book that's there at the bottom, Eco Mind, Changing the Way We Think to Create the World We Want. So she created this Center for Living Democracy, and they basically went around and found examples, hundreds and hundreds of examples of people embracing a deeper, richer form of democracy and how well it worked. And all of those are on the website for the Center for Living Democracy. So you can read them and feel really inspired by them, that this is possible. And it doesn't matter the level of poverty, it didn't matter the level of oppression. It was just a sense of people kind of shifting their approach into a different connected mindset that led to this embrace and sort of realization of a more resilient, robust kind of democracy. She talks about in EcoMind, she talks about thought traps. And I resonate with these thought traps. Endless growth, these are, very common, right? Endless growth is the problem, we need no growth. Consumerism is the problem, and overpopulation. We must power down and live within limits to survive. Humans must overcome our innate greed, selfishness, and competitiveness to survive. Humans hate rules, so we must be coerced in order to survive. Humans are too disconnected from nature to survive. And it's too late, humanity has failed. So I'm sure all of us have heard these, right? These are really common narratives, and there's validity in all of them. So her point is not that there's no validity in these kind of trains of thought or narratives. Her point is that the effect that these thought narratives and mindsets have is to freeze us. They freeze us from being able to be empowered and engaged. And she tries to offer alternatives where we can just shift our mindset so that we can actually move forward. And I thought as I was reading these, they don't make sense from a Swiss point of view, because the Swiss point of view, it kind of defies these thought traps over and over. She argues that there's a connectedness in which solutions arise in relationships of mutuality. She's not arguing for a liberal provider state. She's not arguing for conservative market-based individualism. She's arguing for a different way of life and daily practice and freedom from these thought traps. So another thing she says, which I thought might be helpful, is that she talks about 3 factors or approaches that seem to make the biggest difference. And I feel like Switzerland embodies these as well. And by the way, I'm not presenting Switzerland as ideal so much as interesting. I just I want to make sure I've made that point. So from concentrated power to shared power. And we just saw that happen in the history of Switzerland. From secrecy and anonymity to more transparency. And remember what happened with all of the book publishing? And the blame game and scapegoating to mutual accountability. Remember the whole taking responsibility for your own messes. And so these kind of factors can move people from scarcity to abundant connection as mindset choice as well. So that's the end. And the thing I want to leave you with to close my talk is a quote from this book, Eco Mind, which I feel like is helpful when we think about thought traps, especially the thought trap of it's too late, and trying to embrace rather an empowered communalism. It's the next 2 slides. Half the world is getting by right now on a daily sum equal to the price of a single American latte or less. About 1 billion of us lack the food and water we need. In the global north, millions are struggling and stressed as well. Even before the Great Recession, it was estimated that almost 60% of Americans will live in poverty for at least a year during their adult lives. In short, catastrophe is already the daily experience of huge numbers. So here's my question. Too late for what? I agree that it is too late to prevent massive change in the climate we humans have taken for granted for thousands of years. Erratic, extreme, and destructive weather is already with us. It is too late to prevent suffering. Terrible suffering is already with us. But it is not too late for life. Life loves life. That's just what we do. In other words, the very essence of life, including the version we call human, isn't changed by climate chaos. It is not too late to be ourselves. In fact, for our species, with its passion for shared action toward common ends, maybe now is the time to be alive. When facing staggering setbacks, most human beings don't end up ruining life. What makes us miserable isn't a big challenge. It's feeling futile, alone, confused, discounted. In a word, powerless. By contrast, those confronting daunting obstacles, but joined with others in common purpose, have, to me, often seemed to be the most alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's excellent presentation, very thought-provoking, and then I believe that you all enjoyed Allison's great presentation today.